Live from the Old City of Jerusalem, Nightline continues. Once again, Ted Koppel.
Get ready to be outraged by history. By the time this program is over, you will have learned what professional historians already know. History is not the objective recitation of truth. It is a story shaded and sculpted by those temporarily in control. History is a tool incurred by politicians to justify their intentions, and in this part of the world, the raw material is limitless. George Santayana's famous aphorism that those who forget the lessons of history are condemned to relive them is incomplete. In the Holy Land, it is precisely the ancient and not so ancient stories told and retold that are used to justify the repetition.
It's very difficult for the Jewish, nice, unique history. You know, I'm Semite. We're cousins, very strange cousins, but we're cousins. We're the son of Abraham. So
just yesterday on this broadcast, the ancient settlers of this land surfaced like ghosts to haunt the political debate. And even the violence itself is defined by different views of history. Take this uprising on the West Bank, or should we call it Judea and Samaria. It's the same place, but while one description is relatively neutral, the other, Judea and Samaria, harkens back to the time of the original Israelite kingdoms of Judah and Samaria during the reign of King Solomon, a time when these steps on ancient Mount Moriah led to a temple built over 1,600 years before this golden dome claimed the mountaintop for Islam. Just below where I'm standing, you can see the rubble of empires. The geography of this land has been redefined by conquest after conquest, and each successive empire has engraved its mark. You can see the remains of Roman pillars, Byzantine and Crusader forts, Saracen palaces and mosques, Christian churches, and surrounding the entire Old City, a Turkish wall built by the Ottomans during their 400-year reign. Other empires left less visible but equally valuable footprints. After freeing the Jews from captivity in Babylon, the Persians allowed them to rebuild a second sacred temple on Mount Moriah, on the same spot where Solomon's original temple stood. Although that second temple was also destroyed, this time by the Romans, its remaining western wall symbolizes the political claim of the Jews to this land.
This interlocking relationship of God, a people, and a land which he promised them, to which they are eternally bound, is something that every Jew is constantly conscious and subconsciously aware of.
When God sent Abraham out of Ur to seek the promised land, Abraham left what was then Mesopotamia and is now Iraq. And what Abraham discovered was the land of Canaan. Today, that land is the state of Israel. Indeed, the boundaries of today's Israel outline much the same territory as that settled by the tribes of Joshua after they seized the land from the Canaanites 3,000 years ago. But if those Canaanites had descendants, might they not be able to claim historical precedence over the Jews? Today's Palestinians say that indeed they are the descendants of Canaan and that they do have precedence.
We think of ourselves as Arabic and we are part of the Arab world, but originally and historically we are the descendants of the Canaanite people.
Today's Palestinians point to a cultural link to the Canaanites, a heritage of custom and traditions rather than a written record.
If you go to the villages, you can find many traces of the Canaanite culture, the architecture, the way they build their houses, also the way they work in the fields. You can trace this thing easily back to the Canaanites.
These Palestinians do not claim any kind of direct racial link to the Canaanites. After all, since the time this Canaanite village existed, a multitude of nations have invaded the land and mixed with the people. For example, the Philistines, who landed on the coast of Gaza, who fought the armies of Saul. The name Palestine derives from the Greek name Philistine. Those Philistines most certainly intermarried with some of the Canaanites.
Of course, we cannot deny that we have that relationship, that lineage with the Philistines. But also at the same time, we must confess to the fact that the present generation of the Palestinians is also a lineage of the other races who came here.
That racial mix, the Palestinians say, reflects the very history of the land, a land defined by conquest after conquest. Those whose heritage reflects that mixture of influence say they are the land's true descendants. Their claim is one of historical continuity.
I'm proud of the civilization which was here during the Hebrew period, during the Roman, during the Greek, during the Islamic period. All these periods are my periods. So I am the result of a historical process.
And what do the Israelis say? They invoke the book of Genesis and God's covenant with Abraham. As an everlasting possession, I will give you and your descendants after you the land in which you are now aliens, all the land of Canaan, and I will be God to your descendants. A warning about what you will see when we come back. Modern history is a minefield. Even if you know beyond a shadow of a doubt what happened out here, someone else's version is just waiting to explode in your face. The task of reporting the modern history of Palestine and Israel from the vantage points of Palestinians and Jews. These are not, nor were they intended to be, objective reports. At times, the two versions are irreconcilable. That's the point. It's part of what the struggle here is about. James Walker reports the Palestinian version of recent history, Judd Rose, the Jewish version.
In the morning, they wept. As sirens wailed across the land, the people of Israel fell silent in memory of those who died to create and defend the Jewish state. And in the evening, they danced. In Israel, the end of Memorial Day means the start of Independence Day, and last week, Israelis celebrated their 40 years as a nation. From silent grief to joyous abandon, and all in a day.
Sorrow and joy are mixed up in Israeli life. We go from sorrow today to joy tomorrow. There's no other way you can live here. But it's the best place in the world for a Jew to live.
A place for Jews to live, a safe haven in a world where all too often Jewish blood came cheap. A century ago, vicious anti-Semitism was sweeping Russia and Europe, and out of that came a movement to create a Jewish home in the ancient land of Zion. The movement was called Zionism. Its author, a Hungarian journalist named Theodor Herzl.
The idea of the Jewish state as an answer to the problem of Jewish inferiority and inequality and homelessness became real with Herzl in 1897 when he gathered a Congress of Jews, the first Zionist Congress, to proclaim the great cry, the Jews who wish it will have their state.
But where? Herzl asked the Turks for part of Palestine, and then the British for Cyprus. For a time, the British offered to resettle the Jews in what's now Uganda. But even as Herzl's search went on, many Jews were already heading for Palestine, the land the Bible said God had given to the children of Abraham.
We were crazy. We were so small, so few in this. You see, it was a vast area from horizon to horizon. Here was several tens of Jews, there several tens of Jews, but we believe something that will happen.
Izhar Smolansky's father came from Russia in 1890 as part of the great wave of immigration called Aliyah. The immigrants arrived with a cherished idea of what the biblical homeland would be like. What they found was a hostile land filled with swamps and snakes and scorpions and Arabs.
Nobody of us dared to go far away at night because it was dangerous.
Why?
This is the way our parents grew up. Beware, careful. You cannot believe them that they will not touch you. So we were careful.
To Jews, the Arabs were mysterious, dangerous. To Arabs, the Jews and their European ways were just as alien. So they lived side by side, but not together.
The Arabs figured just as an obstacle.
Marin Benveniste's father was from Spain, his mother from Russia.
They just came here because they needed to establish a safe haven. And they felt so desperate that the rest of the world just didn't matter.
In the years that followed, Jewish settlements sprouted throughout the land. By 1914, there were 100,000 Jews in Palestine. Chaim Weizmann was now leader of the Zionist movement and making believers out of the British. In 1917, they approved the Balfour Declaration, endorsing a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine.
Somebody's described it as the only example in diplomatic history of persuasion without power. But from that moment, it was serious because the Jewish national home became a legal and political concept.
And more. With World War I ending and Palestine falling into British hands, the Zionist dream seemed within reach at last.
There is a Palestinian proverb that says, if you have no land, you have no honor. To the Palestinians, the issue has always been land. In 1917, Palestinians demonstrated against the Balfour Declaration and British support for a Jewish homeland. After all, they then represented some 90% of the population here. Yet the Balfour Declaration had in effect called them intruders, referring to them as the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Palestinians who have lived under occupation since the 16th century felt that the chance to decide their own future had been stripped away again, this time by the mighty British.
This was a very qualitative increase in the danger of Zionism to us, because it now meant that it had come under the wing of the greatest imperial power of the world.
While Palestinians had cultivated this land for over 1,000 years, with Jews living in scattered areas, the first Zionist colony north of what is now Tel Aviv did not appear until 1878. As the mass migration of Jews grew, the Palestinian landscape took on a far different appearance. And when Zionist leaders held their first Congress in 1897, calling for creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, Palestinians marked the date as the start of their modern tragedy.
From the Palestinian point of view, that was, that in retrospect, was the declaration of war on us.
Walid Khalidi's ancestors lived in Palestine since the Middle Ages. In 1899, 2 years after the first Zionist Congress met, a relative of his received an important message from Theodor Herzl, founder of the modern Zionist movement.
This is a letter, as you can see from the date. It's 19 of March 1899. It was sent from Vienna to a great uncle of mine called Yusuf Zia Khalidi, who was mayor of Jerusalem in 1899.
In the letter, written in French, Herzl made a critically important pledge that if Zionists were not welcome in Palestine, they would go someplace else.
S'il n'acceptera pas, if it is not acceptable, nous chercherons, we shall look, and believe me, we shall find somewhere else, nous trouverons ailleurs ce qu'il nous faut, that which we need.
To Khalidi, the significance of the letter is more than just that Herzl broke his word, or that Zionists meant no harm to Palestinians.
We're talking about whether the Zionism had a right which overrode the rights of the indigenous population. That's one issue. And the answer to that, in my opinion, is no, they did not. If you say God said that to them, my answer is Allah did not tell me that. Jehovah may have told them that, but Allah did not tell me that.
And to Khalidi, equally important is his family's ties to the land, an association that is not unique.
My family has been in Jerusalem continuously since for the last 1,000 years, which is a little bit longer than the Mayflower, and is virtually 1066, like the Norman invasion of England.
The Palestinians lived under British rule for 30 years, beginning in 1918 with the end of World War I. By 1920, there were almost 40 Zionist colonies in Palestine. Behind the British military shield, Jewish immigration continued to build. So too did Palestinian frustration, until finally in 1936, the outrage against Britain's one-sided pro-Zionist policy crystallized in the Arabs' first armed rebellion.
More than 400,000 Jews have settled in Palestine, hoping with British help to build the new Zion. Arabs fear that the rising tide of immigrants will drive the shepherd and his flock further and further from the rich pastures. Hence discontent has become open rebellion. Fear grips the Arab that extermination faces him and his mode of life.
The fighting between Palestinians and the British lasted for 3 years, from 1936 until 1939. Faced with the upcoming demands of a world war, Britain unleashed its full military power against the Palestinians and smashed their revolt. Some 5,000 Palestinians died. 15,000 were wounded.
They crushed the rebellion with these heavy losses of life. They disbanded all political organizations. They exiled the political leadership. They disarmed, systematically disarmed the population, and the Palestinian population. They armed the Jewish population.
The Palestinians, defenseless and politically weak, now had to contend with Jewish determination to take over Palestinian soil. A determination that was underscored in 1940 by Joseph Weitz, a leader in the Zionist land acquisition program, who wrote, "There is no room for both peoples. If the Arabs leave, the land will be broad and open to us. If the Arabs stay, the land will be narrow and barren." As the saying goes, if you have no land, you have no honor. The plot to drive Palestinians from their land was in place.
The Jews of Palestine were thinking not of conquest, but defense after a decade of Arab violence. 1929, a dispute over use of the Western Wall leads Arab mobs to attack Jerusalem's Jewish quarter. Quickly, the violence spreads to other towns and settlements.
The Arabs burned all the village, and you can see half of the horizon with fire. I remember it. I was a kid. I remember it. I wouldn't forget it.
None of the Jews would. The attacks were cruel and bloody. In Hebron alone, 60 Jews were killed. After 4 days of rioting, the Arabs had murdered 135 Jews, wounded 399 more. The British responded by suggesting severe limits on Jewish immigration. But the tens of thousands who'd arrived after World War I had already transformed Palestine. They came from Europe to build utopia, and soon there were cities with stores and schools and factories. The socialism they brought found its root in farming communes called kibbutzes.
The kibbutz was the temple of our youth. In that temple we worshipped Zionism, both in our hikes in the desert, by knowing the nests of all bald eagles, or the names of all the ancient fortresses of the Jewish revolt, as well as the name of each cow.
But while the Jews in Palestine were building a dream, the Jews in Europe were witnessing a nightmare. As Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, persecution of Jews spread like a plague and triggered a flood of frightened refugees to head for Palestine. The sudden torrent of immigration prompted the Arabs to rebel.
Those outbursts of violence were the major factor which influenced the British government gradually and in the end drastically to withdraw its support from Zionism. They were really making Britain pay too heavy a price for the support of Zionism.
In Europe, the Jews were in twilight. A great boat lift was started to bring refugees to the Promised Land.
A lot of us intend to go to Palestine and to begin there a new life in our homeland.
But for most, it was not to be. The British stopped and sent back as many of the boats as they could. And in 1939, they put a limit on Jewish immigration to only 15,000 a year. The doors of Palestine were closed. Nation after nation sealed its borders. There was no escape. For the Jews of Europe, night had come. "6 million Jews were dead. And for the Jews of Palestine, that meant the time for excuses was over. Independence was no longer a dream. It was a demand. Tens of thousands of Holocaust survivors in European displacement camps wanted to go to Palestine, but the British stuck to pre-war immigration limits. The refugees came anyway, sailing on desperately overcrowded ships. The British showed no mercy and turned the ships back. Between 1945 and 1948, 63 ships sailed to Palestine. Only 5 got through. Yuri Ben-Ari helped bring the illegals in.
So of course the emotion was unbelievable. Kissing of sand was, you could see it every moment. But the people cried, and we cried together with them.
For some, the response was not tears, but terrorism. Jewish underground armies had formed, Haganah on the left, and on the right, the Irgun, led by men who would one day be leaders of the Jewish state. A campaign of assaults on British installations led finally to this, July 1946. The Irgun bombed Jerusalem's King David Hotel, the British headquarters. 91 were killed. The British public was stunned. The mandate was doomed. Now it was up to the United Nations to deal with Palestine. And after 9 months of debate, the General Assembly approved a plan to divide the land, a Jewish state and an Arab state. A homeland for the Jews at last. In the morning, they danced, but soon they would weep.
When we continue with our look at the history of this region later in our broadcast, we will return with more on the history, but we'll take couple. When we left our examination of modern Jewish and Palestinian history, the dreams of the Zionists were just about to be realized. As we resume that story now, James Walker underscores the point that for the Palestinians, that dream was all of their worst fears come true.
For many centuries before Zionism brought Jews to Palestine, Arabs had lived on this land, and it was the land the United Nations partition took away.
The holy city of Jerusalem is a scene of bloodshed and terror as the United Nations division of Palestine inflames violence between Arab and Jew. Burning, shooting, and pillaging mark the beginning of the partitioning.
To the Palestinians in November 1947, partitioning called for civil war because under the UN agreement, the Jews, who occupied only 6.5% of Palestine, were given control of 55% of the land. It's the same as if Americans who lived in Utah and Arizona were suddenly awarded control of more than half the United States. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were driven from their homes, creating a new generation of misery. The fact that the Palestinian exodus went largely unnoticed by the world was further proof of the terrible isolation and powerlessness these people suffered. Their exodus was intensified by an event that took place here. In 1948, this was the site of a quiet, absolutely peaceful village named Deir Yassin. Peaceful until on an early April morning, Israeli soldiers committed a cold-blooded atrocity that has become an infamous symbol to Palestinians of Israeli brutality. Today, Miriam Atiya's home is part of an Israeli mental hospital. In 1948, she was asleep with her mother, her brothers, and her grandparents when the attack began. She escaped, but 42 family members were killed.
Our house was in the path of the Israel attack. I was 8 years old. 6 people were killed in the house I lived in. My uncle, 2 brothers, my mother, and my grandfather.
As many as 250 Palestinian men, women, and children were slaughtered. Some women were raped, then shot dead. Bodies were mutilated and stuffed down wells. Anwar Khatib helped gather together 25 children who had been orphaned by the massacre, which he said was part of a deliberate campaign to terrify Palestinians.
Many of our people in the villages left their villages without fighting because they were afraid that what happened in Deir Yassin will be repeated.
About 1 month later, on the same day British rule officially ended, Israel became a state.
What is the war of independence to Israel is the war of the catastrophe to the Arabs. This is how things look different from different points of view. The view from the top of an elephant from the Maharaja's seat is unlike the view seen by the attendant on foot.
The Palestinians had lost almost everything: their homes, their communities, the cultural ties to the land. Most of all, they had lost the greater part of Palestine.
For Jews around the world, it was a moment of biblical scope. The promise had been kept. A nation was born, but conceived in blood, Jewish blood.
The Arabs did not accept the partition of Palestine. They wanted all of Palestine.
The civil war was brutal. The Arabs matched the Jews blood for blood. 4 days after Deir Yassin, a medical convoy was ambushed. 77 doctors and nurses were massacred by the Arabs. Here in the Judean hills, these trucks are left by the highway as a memorial to another massacre. They were part of a convoy bringing food and other supplies to the 100,000 Jews trapped in the siege of Jerusalem. The convoys were easy targets for Arab snipers. In 6 months, 49 Jews were killed. And this being such a tiny nation, the losses of war were especially staggering.
You can understand what will happen to the spirit of a unit when you start out with 200, and then you are 150, then you are 120, and then you are 80, and then you are 40, and then you are 20, and you are 15. And whenever you go out at night for an operation, you bet who will come back and who will not come back.
But many of those who fought with Yuri Ben-Ari were survivors of the Holocaust. They were not to be denied.
Whatever the Germans did to them, they couldn't do anything about it. All of a sudden, he had a rifle, and he could defend himself. So he was very proud. And many of them slept with the rifle and kissed the rifle, whatever you want to say.
First rumblings of a major battle for Jerusalem follow systematic British withdrawals from the Holy City.
The British gone, Arab and Jew were alone on the stage at last. The day David Ben-Gurion proclaimed Israel's independence, the armies of 7 Arab nations marched in to snuff out the Jewish state. That day, a young soldier named Yisar Smolansky was one of those sent to take an Arab village where snipers had closed off a main supply road. Back there 40 years later, Smolansky recalled charging up the hill when the shooting suddenly stopped.
And when he got up, breathless at this place, we saw the natives of this village run away. And their belongings on donkeys and camels and horses on the top of their heads, and they ran away.
Smolansky told us it was the same in every Arab village he saw. They fled, assuming that the Arab armies were right behind to finish off the Jews.
Nobody threw them away. They threw themselves away. And I was eyewitness.
Well, there's a controversy. Did they flee because they were promised by their leaders that they ought to flee or not? The fact is that when there's a war, people try to get out of the way.
One fact was beyond dispute. When the War of Independence ended 7 months later, 6,000 Israelis were dead, 1% of the entire population of the new country.
Palestinians seldom talk of the year 1948. Instead, they refer to it simply as Nakba, the year of the catastrophe. Between 1948 and 1950, Israel systematically destroyed 379 of 475 Arab villages, bulldozing or dynamiting homes and leveling the land. Sharif Kanana, who documented the Israeli destruction, discovered that the Zionists had a carefully thought-out scheme.
Occupy land, remove Arabs and remove any signs of their existence, bring Jewish people and replace them.
The Israelis deliberately tried to wipe out the Palestinian civilization. A mosque was desecrated, turned into Charlie's restaurant, cafe, and bar. A Palestinian cemetery became a playground. Deir Aban was a Palestinian village that existed for 2,000 years. That is, until 1948, when Israeli troops drove out the people and blew up the houses.
My father was the Mukhtar of the village.
Abdul Aziz Abdul Hadba was 13 years old then. He still considers this his home.
Were you born in this house? In this house, exactly. In this room.
You mean the room that was here?
In the west room. Take care, please, because there is a well here.
There is a what?
A well.
A well?
Yes. The sound of water. I remember the 18th of October.
The day?
The day, exactly. It's nearly the same time as now. When my father came to us and said to us, now it's off. We can't stay more here.
It's over.
It's over, yes. If I see the house in which I was born, the cave in which I put my cows or horses, and the well which I came down sometimes to clean it.
The well?
The well, the water. The places where my friends played many times. Well, how can I say to this land, it's not my land?
Thrown off their land, the 2,000 villagers of Deir Aban joined hundreds of thousands of other Palestinians in refugee camps.
They didn't have clothes, they didn't have water, they didn't have food, they didn't have nationality, they didn't know what's going to happen to them tomorrow.
Faced with continuing uncertainty and a world that didn't care, Palestinians looked with pride to the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO was formed in 1964.
So our leaders said, look here, we have tried it peacefully from 48 till 65. Let us start the use of the weapon.
PLO guerrillas launched attacks against Israel as well as other targets designed to draw attention to the plight of the Palestinians.
They are not terrorists. They are freedom fighters. They want to recover their country. They want to recover their home.
But recovery of their homeland was not to be. In 1967, the Palestinians lost what remained of Palestine. Israel conquered it all.
These days, they tell it to the tourists.
And you have come back to Jerusalem, not to stay ever again next year in Jerusalem, but this year we are in Jerusalem.
It seems hard to remember now, but for the Israelis of 1967, it was still next year in Jerusalem. The country's border with Jordan cut right through the Holy City. Its frontier with the rest of the Arab world put it within vulnerable range of any sudden attack. Still, Israel had become powerful and prosperous since 1948. Jews came from around the world to make this their home. They took the mud and marshes and desert and made them bloom. Backed by American aid, Israel's military was strong and ready. So when Arab powers prepared to attack, the Israelis struck first. With a speed and sureness that stunned even its allies, Israel demolished the Arab forces on the ground and in the air. General Yuri Ben-Ari led his troops into the ancient city of Jericho.
You remember back to the walls of Jericho, which were falling because of the trumpets and so on and so on. My soldiers found during this little period we were standing and waiting, went into Ramallah, found a hotel there. There was a band, a dancing band, took the trumpets, and we attacked Jericho again with trumpets.
Israeli troops also reclaimed the old city of Jerusalem and marched to their holiest site, the Western Wall. Meron Ben-Veniste was there that day. He told us that for a Jew to return to the wall after the Arabs had kept them out for 19 years, it was a moment of redemption.
It was like a miracle. I myself couldn't believe it. I came here, I touched the wall, the stones, and I left. And only when I heard the announcement on the radio, I realized, and I started weeping.
In 36 hours, we finished what we couldn't do in 19 years before on the war of independence.
What Israel had done was to again redraw the map of the Middle East and establish itself as the superpower of the region. But the sword of victory was double-edged. Israel now absorbed over 1 million Arabs in the new territories, a third of them refugees from the War of Independence. The gutty little underdog was now a brawny occupying power. Never again would victory be as sweet. Not in the Yom Kippur War, which a surprised Israel nearly lost. Not in the push into Lebanon, the first Israeli war that wasn't purely defensive. That opened a wound in the national psyche that bleeds again in 1988.
The problem with Israel is not its physical survival. It is the soul of this land. That is what is now at stake.
Since the occupation, Meren Ben-Veniste has lived in an Arab neighborhood of East Jerusalem. He calls it a twilight zone.
I don't want to be over-optimistic, because my children grew up in this neighborhood. We live here for 17 years. They don't have a single Arab friend. They don't even speak Arabic.
How is that?
Because they don't speak Arabic because they have nothing to do with these people. They go to the Boy Scouts, they go to school, they speak Hebrew. And these people go to their own schools. We live back to back.
A century after Zionism was born, the dream has come true in ways that none of the founders could have imagined. But they had a vision of an ideal society, and Israel is not that. It's flawed, confused, and no longer so sure of its course. But if Israelis have doubts about the future, they are sure of the lessons of the past.
What remained really of the Holocaust in our minds is security. We are crazy for security. We will do everything possible. We'll defy the whole world, if necessary, to have our security. So we would like very much to be loved by the whole world. But if there's a question to be loved or to live, we go to live.
To live, to be secure, that promise has been kept. To live in peace, now that's the dream, the vision of next year in Jerusalem.
Last December, life under Israeli occupation became too intolerable for the Palestinians to take. That marked the start of Intifada, the uprising.
What's happening now since 4 months is very important, and it has no similar past. Similar in the past. Much better than 1967 war, 1956, 1948, 1973 of our Sadat. What is going on now? It is a real uprising. People are against occupation. They don't do occupation. We don't want it.
No more Israeli occupation.
No more Israeli occupation. We don't want it at any cost.
In return for throwing rocks, they have been shot dead. More than 170 of them. Thousands of others have been wounded. Yet they keep throwing. And once again, the Israelis are bulldozing and blowing up Palestinian homes, destroying the land. The uprising has forged a new sense of unity among Palestinians.
We are the chosen people. I am a Palestinian. I am proud to be a Palestinian. And I am ready to die for Palestine.
40 years ago, it was the children of Palestinians who lost their land. Now, it's their grandchildren, 3 generations without a home. The time has come, they believe, to regain their honor.